Christin, thank you so much for coming on. The Liberty Bell herself, ladies and gentlemen. Christin, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. All right, super excited to have you back on to continue our discussion on Article 2, the executive branch, where last week we kind of talked about the broad, general executive branch, the main kind of, well, not main, the general powers of the presidency, what it means to be the executive. This week we want to kind of dive into this more specifics of the branch itself and kind of the other little doodads in the four sections.
The nuts and bolts, yeah, exactly.
So let's see. I guess where do we want to start? Right, you know, Commander in Chief. We talked about last week. Oh, sorry, no, that's Section 2. I'm so sorry.
Commander in Chief, Section 2. Oh, I see.
No, yeah. Sorry, no,
That's a good part.
yeah, we're off to a great start. No, all right, Section 1. Section 1, the executive vesting clause. Kind of talked about that last week. Section 2, or I should say Clause 2 of Section 1. The president's term of 4 years. Nothing too controversial here. It is interesting to note that that it's kind of different as opposed to the House of Representatives and the Senate. You have the House of Representatives 2 years, the Senate 6 years, and it's kind of this nice compromise of 4 years in between where they thought it was enough to allow him to be energetic, as Hamilton would describe, but also not enough time to destroy the country.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's also interesting that one of the framers actually considered that the president should be appointed by the legislature during the convention, which was obviously opposed by everybody there, including Madison and George Mason.
Yeah, they kind of, I mean, if you think about it, Parliament in most, I think it's like 100 and, I don't remember, however many countries in the world have parliamentary systems, and in that they do elect their, I guess, executive prime minister via their parliament or legislature, right? And so that's a very normal thing to do.
It's definitely normal.
The founders did consider that. I mean, that was on the table. But they felt like a, really lazy or weak president would be really dominated by Congress, or a too powerful president would dominate Congress. So they didn't really want to go that route. But they also didn't really like the idea of the citizens having complete say either. I don't know if we're there yet, but...
Oh, we'll eventually get there in Electoral College. But let's keep working through this. Next section, next clause. The vice president is established, basically. And, nothing too controversial here, but what is interesting to note is that mainly his main duty is actually more legislative than it is executive. He's the president of the Senate, and his role is actually cast the vote in the event that the Senate is locked.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of interesting where, there's this idea of separation of powers, but in this case, they actually say, no, he's going to, kind of be an executive on standby, but mainly act as a legislator.
Yeah, that's true. I had not really thought about that before. I mean, he's not really given a lot of power to begin with, so I guess they had to do something with him, Yeah,
and that's funny. Yeah, you see kind of President Trump now. He's kind of taken the vice president and kind of made him in charge of, this Corona task force.
Right,
and,
that's true. There's something to do.
Yeah, exactly. I think being the vice president is probably the easiest job in the world because you don't even do anything.
Exactly. It is until it becomes the hardest job if something happens,
That's true, yeah.
Suddenly you're president.
Yeah, that's true. Let's see. And actually we'll see that in later examples when we get to, presidential succession. But moving on into the next clause, the presidential electors. So this is the first instance where we're introduced to this idea of the presidential electors. And I admit I still am kind of confused about this whole process, the college itself, but at least for this clause, it says that, we have all these different kinds of modes of elections, and some are popular, some are direct appointment. This one is really interesting because it is a really nice blend of both, and we'll see that in the way it's kind of organized. The amount of electors is decided by your number of representatives and your senators. So whatever your representatives are, plus 2, those are how many electors your state has, which gives it both those elements of populism and state appointment, especially given the fact that after 1880, all the states had their electors be elected by a popular vote.
Right.
An interesting question can arise up, though, is that what like, can these electors do kind of whatever they want once they're elected? This is one of the issues that I think we're kind of seeing now, where some people anyway, are fed up with the Electoral College, and some states have said, "Oh, we're gonna have our guys vote this way," and that's kind of an interesting question. I mean, typically it hasn't been. Go ahead.
I mean, the Constitution doesn't give any directives on that, so there's nothing like legally binding for the electors as far as who we vote for and them having to vote for who we vote for. So, yeah, I mean, in that regard, but at the same time, I don't think the state can direct them either. I think that they pretty much have, I mean, they can do whatever they want, basically.
Yeah, I think
they really can. Like, yeah.
I think that does prescribe that the, now I'm going to have to get specific because this is what we're trying to do here. I think it does let states decide the manner, at least, because you know what it is? All right, I know what it is, actually. So the states can decide the manner in which these guys are elected. And what a lot of them have done is bound the electors to, like, some kind of oath thing, like, if you're going to assume this position, you have to vote, the way of, whatever the people say. So
yeah, that's generally speaking how they handle it. It's just that that doesn't come from any sort of, like, there's no constitutional confinement to that.
True.
So that's just based upon any sort of state preference or regulation or whatever. But I don't think the state can directly tell the electors what to vote. So I think they can only tell them that they are bound to what the citizens say, I guess. Mm-hmm. But
yeah, it'd be interesting because historically speaking, they haven't gone against what the people have wanted. But I mean, now with people and their dissent for the Electoral College, now you have some of them kind of playing around with that idea, which I don't know exactly how I feel about it.
It's a problem. It's a major problem. I don't think that I would go over. I don't think it's going to go over. At least I could be wrong. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that the Electoral College needs to be changed, or if it were to be changed, it should be handled appropriately and constitutionally, and that's not the constitutional way of changing the Electoral College. So
I agree.
Because that's something that's specifically listed or laid out in the Constitution. So it can't just be completely thrown out, right? Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to the next clause, this is actually the Electoral College itself. Basically describes the process for counting and for, where it happens, who gets to do it. My research, I'm still kind of confused by this a little bit, the exact process of how the counting occurs. My understanding is that, the people will vote, whatever that plurality is, the majority, then it goes to those electors, and those electors will, I guess, that it all gets counted with the electors after they decide they're going to vote in favor of, I guess, the supporting candidate. It then goes to the vice president, and then is counted in front of Congress to determine who the winner is. I don't know, do you have any more insight on that? I'm not too confident in my knowledge of how it actually is counted.
I have tried really hard to research the Electoral College in detail, and it's very complex. And I think part of that is because every state is different, and because the mode of electing is left to the states by the Constitution, every state's election process is different, which makes the whole process complicated. So there's no one answer. But I do know that basically when you're voting, when you go to the polls to vote, you're not voting for the president, you're actually voting for electors. So you have a group of electors that have pledged to vote for the Republican candidate and a group that's pledged to vote for the Democrat candidate. And whichever one you vote for is the one that will go vote for you or on your behalf, come December. I can't remember the exact date it is in December. So that to me is kind of interesting because I think so many people think when they go and they vote for Trump or Hillary or whatever it is, that they're voting for the actual president when in fact they're actually voting for the people who have pledged to vote for that candidate. This was I think it really was kind of an ingenious plan by the founders because they really did not trust people at all. So they didn't like the idea of the citizens having this direct democratic vote for the president. Because they just knew that citizens in general were not educated and didn't really know anything and are usually going to be moved by emotional whims and irrational kind of whatever it was in the moment, the zeitgeist of the moment.
Populism,
right?
majoritarianism.
Yeah, we're seeing
absolutely.
that today. I mean, even in their crisis today, it's just like people lose a lot of the kind of rational way of thinking or approaching government because of this sort of emotional distress. And we've seen a lot of extreme moves by the government because of that. And so anyway, they didn't want that, and they also didn't want the legislative branch doing it. So they came up with this funky hybrid, and they were very confident that most of the so they really thought that there would not be a clear majority winner for elections, because they thought that every state would have, so since the electors are elected by the state and they can sort of select who they want, they thought it'd be like everyone's like favorite nephew or son or whatever that would get elected for each state. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there wouldn't be like a clear winner, so then it would end up going to Congress, and so it would give this really good fair balance between the small states and the large states, because of course the small states were concerned about being dominated by the large states. Of course that never happened, because we ended up really quickly devolving into that two-party system.
Yep.
But it still has worked pretty well, because it's prevented this like tyranny of like the cities, right?
Yes.
So it's really think about it. If we were to change and go by popular vote, for one, we would be subject to this emotional whim of the irrational, uneducated public. But two, we would basically be, it would basically be like 5 cities electing the president every year or every 4 years, which that's not a good idea, because now you've got tons of rural states and smaller states, southern states, Midwest states that have no say whatsoever, and you may as well just leave them out of the election process altogether. And that means the president's only going to be campaigning to those 5 cities, and all of his policy preferences are going to be tailored to aid and help and support those 5 cities at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah,
so there's
exactly
major negative consequences to changing the Electoral College, and so I think that the states themselves are shooting themselves in the foot, because I think about 15 of them have said that they wanted to like, they weren't going to go with what the electoral college points would be. They're going to like only go by the popular vote. And I'm like, do you realize the national popular vote that is? And I think to myself, do they realize that they're actually going to be going against what their own citizens want by going with the national popular vote? That's absurd. So anyway, that's my little spot there.
No, all good stuff. It's interesting. Are you familiar with the work of Tara Ross?
No.
Oh, Tara Ross. She's probably I would say the leader on defending the Electoral College. She's written a book on it. She's another friend of Liberty who I've tried to get in contact with, but I think she's probably a bit too famous for me.
Oh, that's funny.
But yeah, no, she's written extensively on that subject. I'll probably have to dive into that. But for people who are looking, who want to understand the Electoral College at a deeper level, her work I would highly recommend.
That's good stuff.
And you kind of bring up this the scenario of like the cities versus the rural areas, and you're exactly right. Like I can completely imagine a president, if we had a popular vote, like you said, he's only going to go to the most popular states. He's only going to go to the most populated area because he's got to get the votes. And what are some of the issues? What if someone's like, oh, well, the food prices are too high, and so we're going to execute price controls to get those down. Who does that hurt? It hurts your rural, the people growing it upstate, and there's no representation for them. I mean, you're just going to sow the seeds of discord, and who knows? Like nothing good is going to come from that. And kind of just, Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, we can remind people of the last episode, because this, of course, is all predicated on the assumption that Americans have that the president makes law. And he doesn't make law, but because we now expect him to make law, he's the one that we expect to set the agenda for Congress. And so that it would have a much bigger effect in the way that you're saying, because of the fact that we anticipate or expect him to make law. It shouldn't, but it does.
It's interesting, too. I'm just kind of, as we're discussing this, I'm noticing that the process for the Electoral College is very similar to the old process for how we used to do elect senators, whereby you kind of would, exactly. in a lot of states, I mean, it was different from state to state, but most states had a popular vote for like a senator that, the state legislature would choose. People would vote on it, and then that guy would go end up being one of the senators. One of the arguments against it was, you're having politicians elect politicians. And it's kind of sort of similar in this case. Now, it's a little bit, I guess it's a little bit more a direct appointment than it is a popular or direct popular vote. But it is
Right.
interesting that they're very similar.
They are very similar. Yeah, that's a good point.
Let's see. Next clause is the presidential vote. Basically says it's got to be the same day, decided by Congress. No big deal there. Standards for. Well, is there something controversial there?
No. It's just that I was laughing because it isn't a big deal. It isn't a big deal.
Yeah, but it's like, just one of those clerical things. You just gotta, dot your
Right.
I's and cross your T's. Eligibility stands for president.
Teeth, cross your eyes, but
Oh yeah. President's got to be 35. He has to be a resident of the United States for at least, I guess live in the country for 14 years and be a U.S. citizen, either by naturalization or, I guess, birthright. And the main point of this, at least as far as I've seen, is that the idea is just to limit foreign influence in the elections. They did kind of speculate that maybe someone might come over here and have allegiances to other countries and kind of just come in here with a bunch of money and start campaigning and this and that. And they just kind of wanted to minimize that.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like from Montesquieu's perspective, so Montesquieu, for anyone listening that doesn't know who he is, he's a French philosopher, and he had a lot of political philosopher, and he had a lot of influence on the American founding. Mm-hmm. I think it was like a third of all of the documents sourced Montesquieu.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So
he was the most widely cited philosopher among the framers.
Very, very much so. Yeah. So he was very much in this whole idea of the spirit of the laws. I don't know. I think we've talked about this, but and his idea was that for a democracy to work, and of course we don't technically have a democracy, but we have democratic principles. It has to have something called virtue, which is this idea that there's a respect or love of the law, right? And that's something that doesn't come in a split second. That's something that is sort of bred into someone over time as they live in a country and they are sort of inundated with the virtues and the values and the law of that country, and they learn to respect and to adhere to those laws. And so I think that was sort of the motivating push for the founders in regards to making sure that the people in government had either lived there for a certain amount of time, be it for the senators or for the legislators in the House, or for the president, especially for the president, since he's representing the country as a whole. And I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty logical. It's not like you or I would go over to France and be expected to run for president within the next couple weeks, right? Mm-hmm. That would be absurd. We don't know the culture of France. We don't know anything about France. We don't know their laws. We don't know. I mean, we haven't been, that's just silly to think about. So I think it's a little weird when people critique that aspect, because I'm like, well, you wouldn't expect any other country to do that if somebody comes in and suddenly expects to be able to be in some leadership position. That wouldn't work out, So that was kind of their impetus. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was very in-depth. Deeper than I would have went. It? But no, that was good because you're exactly right. I mean, I think even Montesquieu says, the nation shouldn't pass a law that's counter to, like, the culture and the values of the people. And like you said, like, you have to kind of be a citizen and, like, know what we're about in order to govern us at all.
Exactly. I don't think it would be healthy to have somebody from, anywhere, Russia, China, anywhere, it come over and they have their whole set of ideals. They have their understanding of government, what they think government should do, how they think government should work, what laws are good, what laws are bad, what values are, everything. They have this whole entire set that's unique to them, unique to their country, and unique to their culture. And it would be completely irrational to then immediately put them in a position of power in a country like ours when ours is completely different. It's just,
absolutely. Yes. So next clause, presidential succession. So this is basically saying that when the president can't act, the vice president becomes the acting president. And then anything after him, Congress is going to decide, whoever that is, if the vice president becomes incapacitated for whatever reason. One of the interesting controversies around this that I researched was this: what does it mean to be unable to execute the office? What does it mean to be, what's going to be like your handicap or inability? It's going to keep you from preventing it. And this was brought up by John Dickerson of Delaware. And it's interesting that there wasn't really a clear answer. The closest thing to an answer was by Madison, where he said that, whatever potential abuses this may have, we're inserting this extra language that if once the president is cured or, the ailment is taken from her, however they worded it, but whatever removed, yes, removed. Whatever the impairment is removed, he can return and assume his duties. And so like for history, it's kind of there are two historical examples that kind of bring this into question. That was the presidency of Garfield and Wilson, where Garfield was, I guess, kind of on his deathbed for a while, and it was kind of this, he's alive, but he's kind of, not so, I guess, conscious or whatnot, and so, his vice president, Chester Arthur, was kind of, he didn't know if he should kind of assume the powers or not. Same thing with Woodrow Wilson and his vice president, Thomas Marshall, where Wilson suffered like this tremendous stroke and, wasn't quite there. And, he was like, well, maybe, it's kind of this ambiguous, like when does a vice president take control of things when kind of these things happen?
I've never thought about that. Honestly, I've never really read that phrase, thought a whole lot about it. But that's a really good question. I mean, to me, it seems rather obvious. Like, oh, okay, well, if the president's in a coma or something, then clearly you would want the vice president taking that position until hopefully the president recovers, or, but at the same time, that is pretty ambiguous, because at what point is it considered like incapacitating? At what point, if he's still up and going, but he's, in a hospital room, does that count as incapacitated? Or, at what point does it make it? That's really interesting. Yeah,
it is.
No answer for people listening.
it's a tough question. I sympathize with John Dickerson, because like you need to this stuff kind of needs to be defined, because you never know. Like, we know men are ambitious, and right. Though you think, your vice president might be your buddy, he also might be trying to take you out or something. You never know. So.
That's true. That's funny.
Okay, moving on. Compensation and emoluments from the states and federal government. This is basically just saying that the president's salary is going to be determined before he takes office, and that it can't be increased or decreased, and that he can't receive, goodies from the states or, anyone in the federal government for stuff, I guess. The only interesting thing I found about this was that Benjamin Franklin suggested that the president shouldn't be paid at all for his services, which is a pretty interesting idea. But the framers kind of rejected that, because they thought, well, if you're not going to get paid, then the only person who can be president is going to be some super rich guy like Trump.
True.
So they got rid of that. But I think for me, it's just it's a matter of keeping him independent from the other branches of government.
True, yeah. And also maybe like, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but if you're getting paid, at least you're going to feel somewhat obligated to treat it like a normal job, like.
True. So. Yeah. You have that extra motivation to be good.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. Last clause in Section 1. It is the oath of office, and this is an interesting one. So basically, it just says that the president, it takes. We're all familiar with it. We all know the Chief Justice comes down, he puts his hand on a Bible, and he says, I solemnly swear to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. This is an interesting one for me, because it for me, it kind of shows that the president has a very strong interpretive role in being the president. Meaning that he is obviously the sword, as described by Hamilton. Like, he doesn't have will or judgment, but he kind of does. Like, if you're gonna defend the Constitution, you kind of have to have an opinion about it. You kind of have to make a judgment about whether things are being violated or not.
True.
And so it's like, it's interesting. And I think it's not that it's like a grant of power, but I think it's more of like a clarification of what his duty actually is. We see examples where he does share power in like the legislative process. And I think this is actually one where he's got to kind of show that I also have to kind of interpret and make judgment calls about things. The only other thing I've noticed about this is some people use this clause as a way to justify, I guess, the unilateral presidential involvement in kind of foreign affairs, specifically for like military stuff. They'll say, listen, he's got to protect and defend the Constitution. I mean, he's got to protect people, so he's got to be able to act and move and not be hindered by Congress.
That's conflating it, because it doesn't say, I will do the best of my ability to protect, preserve, and defend the people of the United States. It says Constitution.
I agree with you, yeah. I know these are the more of the presidentialist perspective.
Right. But I just think that's really interesting. Like, reading this right now, I mean, it's not like I've not read the Constitution before, but there are certain parts you're pulling out that I haven't put a lot of focus on. And I'm just looking at that, and it is really interesting because it doesn't say he's supposed to protect the people. It says he's protecting the Constitution.
That's true, yeah. I know, it's one of those, people like to read into things. And, like, I like I've said in the past on previous podcasts, I do sympathize a little bit with the presidentialists because they do ground it in some good history. But as far as,
Right.
the Constitution is concerned, I think that, you're correct on this. That, obviously I think the Congress declares when we can engage people and not, with some examples being excluded, including, like, invasions or rebellions and those kind of things where, like, kind of instant action is required. And the president,
Right.
has constitutional authority to act then. But as far as, getting involved in foreign affairs, I think he should have more, Congress should actually really assume their authority over this. But so far that hasn't really been the case.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Because if Congress passes a law that's unconstitutional, it's the president's job to enforce the law, but also to defend the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, that's the, that's the big thing.
interpretive part that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, when you're talking about all these things, faithfully executing the laws, the oath of office. I mean, if he has no will or no judgment and, he's just a robot, then if Congress were to pass an unconstitutional law, let's say they bring slavery back, if you're going to have a robot as a president, he's going to go enforce the law because he's the sword and he doesn't have will or judgment. But I think this is one of those clauses, among others, that suggests that no, it's a bit more dynamic than that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, moving on to Section 2. First clause is that he is the commander-in-chief. Again, we've talked about this. He's the chief commanding officer in the Army, and there's great benefits to that. You don't want decisions on the battlefield being made by a group of men who are arguing with each other when, bullets are flying over your head. You need, like, pretty concise decision-making.
Right.
I don't know. I think we kind of talked about that a lot last time. Anything to add to that?
No, I actually so I make my students write a theory paper, and I had one of my students, he was in the military, he's in the Navy, where he had been in the Navy, and his theory was that the president should be required to have X amount of years in active military service. I thought that was really interesting, and I think that's one of those interesting things that the founders, maybe they didn't really think about so much, because you're putting somebody in position where they are technically making those, like, split-second decisions that are very, very important, and yet they may have no experience whatsoever in anything having to do with, like, military, which is really interesting. And I honestly never really thought about it until my student brought that up, and it's just kind of a curious thing, because some of these presidents are, lawyers or farmers or whatever they are, but there's no requirement for any sort of military experience, but they're expected to be the commander-in-chief of the military.
Well, there was a time in history long ago where, your chief commander, whoever, your commander-in-chief, whatever, was like your lead general guy. Like, he was, like, on the battlefield with you.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, Donald Trump definitely is on the battlefield. You know what I mean?
We've gotten away from that, but
I don't think he has any experience in any sort of military. Like, yeah, I mean, some of them have, of course, but anyway, that's not really, it's neither here nor there. I just thought that was an interesting thing, and maybe people could think about that a bit more.
No, yeah, it's definitely interesting. Moving on, it's pretty much the same thing. He's the commander of the militia, so, I mean, same thing there. Next is the opinion clause, and this is a cool one because it establishes a couple different things. Basically, it says that he can require his subordinates, anyone under him, typically your department heads,
right.
He can request that they give them a written opinion of whatever question he's asking. And for me, this is a example of them trying to make the president accountable. They're trying to hold him accountable. They're trying to give him more personal responsibility over his branch. They're showing that whatever the presidency is, he's going to be like creating executive departments. It's not just going to be him up there kind of doing everything by himself. He actually has this ability to kind of not he create departments, but there will be departments. They'll have people kind of helping him execute his duties.
Right.
Things like a chain of command. And really, it kind of is a give to the people that wanted like an executive council, where during the drafting period, some of the founders wanted an executive council, and so basically a body of multiple people that would constitute the executive. And it's interesting that we decided with the unitary executive, but also gave these extra departments, or gave this executive council that people wanted. So there's elements of both, and again, I think it's a good example of kind of the best of both worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of like unpacking that we can maybe do in a different episode about the bureaucracy and the departments and all of that kind of stuff, and the department heads, of course, because it even gets like weird to the point that when they're sitting at the table with the president, the oldest departments get to sit close to him, and the younger ones, so the youngest department has to sit furthest away. So it's almost like the youngest department has the least influence.
I did not know that.
Isn't that funny? So obviously the Department of Homeland Security would be the furthest, and I think Department of Defense would be right up next to him, So yeah, I mean the cabinet themselves, yeah, it isn't a oligarchy per se, or like you were saying, not a unitary executive, but there is this kind of unique aspect to it in that they're working together in this sort of way of trying to influence the president through their opinions and explanations of why they think certain policies should be implemented in certain ways, and he's hopefully going to be involved in that. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a fascinating. The whole relationship between the president and the bureaucracy is very interesting.
Yeah,
because the bureaucracy is subject not just to the president but also to Congress, and so they've got this really weird, constant battle where they're pitting the two against each other to try to get their way, and they're trying to utilize and sort of leverage the president's influence against Congress, or Congress's influence against the president, so they can implement laws the way they want to. And it's just
it's almost like the executive bureaucracies kind of have a mind of their own, almost like it's like a government 100%. spawned by a government
100%. I mean, there is so much I could get into with bureaucracy, because that's the funny thing is the executive branch, we think of Article 2 as only talking about the president, right? Or because we equate the executive branch with the president, when in fact he's like the tiny little tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is huge.
That's true, yeah. I mean, he's kind of the guide for the iceberg, but it's like, like,
it's a big iceberg, man.
I mean, like we've talked about in the past, I mean, you're supposed to be in charge of this bureaucracy, which is over 2 million people, and it's like, you can't be in control of that, no matter how hard you want to be.
No, and that doesn't even count all the private industry that the government now pays to do like 90% of the bureaucratic work, So it's like, yeah.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, you're right. Yeah, we could literally do a whole podcast on that. So let's save that for that podcast. Moving forward, still in Section 2, Clause 4, the pardoning power. This is one people are very familiar with. Basically, he can pardon federal crimes, but he can't pardon impeachment convictions, and he can't state and local convictions. And when I was researching the reason for this, Hamilton suggested that the purpose of this was to restrain justice with mercy and to correct mistakes of the justice system. And it kind of, for me, I think shows another example where the president does have this judgment/interpretive role for the Constitution. Because, I mean, if you're going to pardon someone, you kind of have to make a judgment as to whether the law was violated or not. It goes back to his kind of law enforcement duties.
Interesting. Yep, that is a very law enforcement duty.
So
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I have not studied up on this particular power a whole lot. I mean, I think it makes sense as the commander-in-chief and being a chief executive, And I think it goes really along with the founders and the fact that they're huge proponents of liberty with law, right? But it's very much liberty. So they want to make sure if there's any, misuse of the law, that there's a way to remedy that.
Yeah.
So
it kind of, for me, it reminded me of the Eighth Amendment, where they ban, excessive high bails and cruel and unusual punishment. This idea of kind of mercy within the justice system. So it was kind of a cool thing that I thought about. Let's see. The next one is the treaty clause. we're all familiar with this. It's basically one of these roles where the president works with Congress to establish either treaties or appointments, as we'll see. And we kind of talked about this earlier. One of the interesting conflicts about this is it establishes the process to enter into a treaty, but then how do you answer the question, of treaty terminations?
Right.
Is it the president? Does he do it unilaterally? Can the Senate do it? Or is it like a reversal of the same process? And this isn't ever discussed during by the founders, but it is kind of demonstrated by Washington himself, where he actually exits out of treaties unilaterally, and it's supported by Hamilton and Jefferson, and everyone seems to be pretty cool with it. Mm-hmm. But I don't know exactly how I feel about it. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's I see it in the same light that Madison saw the firing of individuals in the bureaucratic agencies. So, like, obviously the president has to have senatorial advice and consent for appointing all of the various executive positions, or most of them anyway. But he doesn't need to have senatorial consent to fire them, right? He can just do that however he wants and whenever he wants. And I think there's a legitimate reason for that we'll probably discuss here in a second.
Yes.
But I guess maybe it was sort of assumed that once it's been entered into, that the Senate and Congress, they're hands off at that point. So they've made their law, and at this point it's the president's job to execute it. And if at any point it becomes clear to the president that the execution of that law is in some way harming the Constitution, which he's supposed to protect, then it's up to him to remedy that.
Oh, I agree. That was beautifully said.
I've never really thought about this before. Thinking out loud. So.
Oh yeah, no, that's perfect. I mean, honestly, I haven't thought about. Just for this podcast, I did a little bit of research on kind of by clause, but these are all really interesting questions. Like, I mean, that's why there's so much rich history here to discover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, like I don't even know where I really fall. Like I think I guess this is where my strict constitutionalist is going to come out, and I'm just going to say that the Senate, it's not given any sort of power to exit out of treaties, therefore they can't do it. So by definition, the president has to do that, and he has to be the guy to do it, because otherwise, how do you get out of treaties?
Right, exactly. You need to be able to get out of a treaty if it's necessary.
Yeah. The only other interesting tidbit about this is in Article 1, Section 10. It mentions that states are prohibited from entering into treaties and agreements. And so, the question is, what exactly is an agreement versus a treaty? And can a president engage in agreements without, advice and consent from the Senate?
Yeah, well, I don't really think I think obviously no, because it wasn't said that. I know that wasn't said. So, I think it's like this beautiful loophole for people to find and be like, oh, look, there's agreements, which means there's more than just treaties, which means the president has more power, so let's give him more power. I mean, that if it wasn't explicitly stated, it was explicitly stated for states. So for some reason, that means maybe at the time states were trying to bypass the federal government and enter into their own, quote, agreements with other countries and call them agreements to get around it, right? I mean, that's probably what's happening. So that's probably why they specifically said that couldn't happen for states, because they knew states were already trying to do that, right? Maybe they didn't anticipate that the executive would start trying to do that because it was so obvious that if the executive is going to enter in any sort of relationship with another country, it would have to be with the consent of the state via the Senate, right? Because states at that point were represented directly by the Senate since they were elected by the state legislatures. Hence the reason for the Senate being the one to give the approval.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Do you think then that, like, if the president's talking to the leader of a foreign nation, he's just like, all right, like, obviously I gotta, it's kind of like maybe set an agenda, almost kind of like his what is it called? His for like the State of the Union, when he has to give like recommendations out. Can he kind of like maybe enter in like a verbal agreement with the nation before he goes to actually, quote unquote, sign the contract and go through the whole Senate process? Do you think he's allowed to do that?
I mean, I think like there's like genuine just sort of diplomatic relations and like interacting with each other. But I think there would be the knowledge that even if the president said, hey, we're wanting to enter into this agreement or this treaty with you, that the country would be well aware that there's nothing written or set in stone about that until it's gone back and handled the appropriate way. I don't really think there's a problem with that, because there's really nothing done in the legal sense, because at that point he's just sort of, he's a human talking to a human, so of course he can say words. They just don't mean it. They're not going to mean anything at that point. And I mean, it would be weird. The states explicitly knew that they were states, right? I mean, like, they were separate entities, and so they wouldn't want their federal government, the one person of the federal government, going and just making this huge treaty that they're all going to be subject to without having to say. And so, yeah, I
agree entirely. I think the only it gets messy if you try to define agreements to mean something beyond that. But I think I think we've pretty much figured it out because we're so smart. Moving on, Clause 6, Article 2, Section 2. The Appointments Clause. This is a big one, and I'll give you my reason why. Especially, it's actually more relevant now than it is, I think, that it's been in the past.
That's because of the massive, overinflated power of the judicial branch. But yeah.
Oh, really? This is a different take I'm not familiar with. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Oh, you want me? Oh, okay.
I was going to take it in a whole different direction, but go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, if you want to talk about the executive part of it, but and this is the executive branch officials that are being appointed, but the reason that it's such a big deal now for a judicial appointment is because of the power of the judicial branch. So, back in the day, Supreme Court justices served approximately 6 to 9 years on the bench, even though they technically could have been on there for life. But the reason they were only there for so long is because it was just not a very big deal. So
they had virtue back then.
And that also meant when the president would appoint anyone to the Supreme Court, or any other court for that matter, it really wasn't much to think about, because it wasn't like the courts did a lot. So it's not like the Senate had this big, huge debate about it, because why would you debate about something that's really not that important or has little influence or impact on anything? And then as the court's power has ballooned into what it is today, where people are literally voting for the president because of who he will appoint to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, wow,
That's become such a huge power, because now, because of the power of the court, that's what we think about. And that power has become this massive, and now the Senate, this big process, and we see things like the Kavanaugh case and all this ridiculous stuff because of how powerful the courts have become. So that's what I meant when I said that.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you did, because you're so correct, and I just kind of have been so blinded by this other issue that I'll bring up with the Appointments Clause that I totally kind of left my mind about that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The Appointments Clause, we talk about principled officers, but yeah, people know it for federal prosecutors, for associate justices on the Supreme Court. Heads of departments, things of that nature, people who are in serious positions to make stuff happen, basically.
Right.
And so what's interesting about this, for a recent, with respect to a recent controversy, that being the Trump impeachment. So the story goes like this. What is it? What's his name? Jeff Sessions recuses himself, and so Rod Rosenstein assumes kind of this oversight of what is going to be this special counsel that I guess Congress wants to do to investigate Russia collusion with Trump. So Rod Rosenstein appoints Bob Mueller to be the head of this special counsel. Part of the problem with that is that Bob Mueller is now acting as a principal officer. He's acting as a federal prosecutor now, and in a lot of ways was stronger than the President of the United States. The problem with this is that Bob Mueller was never appointed by Trump or confirmed by the Senate. So he was acting as a principal officer without having gone through the confirmation process. So guys like Levin, who cite the work of, I gotta get his name, Steve Calabrese, I think his name is, he's another constitutional professor, and he noted that, listen, anything that Bob Mueller finds is illegitimate. It's poison of fruit of the poison tree, is that he doesn't have the authority to conduct these investigations.
That's fascinating. That's a good point. I didn't know all that. So we both learned something from each other.
Yes. So that's one of the interesting things about it. That whole, I mean, it's another nail in the coffin of that whole impeachment and Trump investigation saga.
Right.
But anyway, moving on from that. The next clause kind of establishes, we just talked about principal officers. It talks about inferior officers, which are just people, like a chief of staff, people who just like kind of help out the president. He can nominate these guys just by himself, or I should say, he just appoints them, and it's good to go.
Right.
Next clause, final clause of Section 2, the recess appointments clause. Basically, the president, when the Senate is not in session and vacancies happen for whatever reason, he can temporarily appoint someone to that position until Congress, or until the Senate returns. And this is basically just to prevent, the executive branch from not being able to act when it needs to act.
Right.
Not really controversial. Anything to add to that?
No. And I mean, there's not very many. So, I don't really know if this is what they're saying because I haven't studied up on this enough, but there's really only once a year that Congress is not technically in session, and that's just at the very end of the year before January 3rd. So that's why pocket vetoes, the only time a pocket veto can legitimately happen is like right at the end of the year. And so I assume that's probably what it means, which means it's probably not going to happen very often because it's only once a year, and it's just an unlikely case. But I don't know if it also means recess, which is more like when they're on summer break or whatever. Yeah,
I think it probably applies, more to back in the day where, these guys were only working for maybe 3 or 4 months, and then they were going home, and so, they got to travel.
Big,
right. Yeah, I mean, they're not going to be around for, like, a long time, so they're, so today, I don't think it really applies for us today because of communications.
They're always in contact.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Anyway. So Section 3, first clause here, is the State of the Union address. And really, this is just, it's just so the president can communicate with the Congress about, his opinions about stuff, really. The only thing I think is notable here is that today we make a really big deal about this, and I think you've talked about this before, that we make a really big deal about it today, and I think this precedent was started by Woodrow Wilson, and it's very fitting that he did do that because he loved this idea of, everyone coming and listening to him talk. Like, he kind of felt like he wanted to be a pseudo-dictator, like have everyone come, sit down, everyone is applauding him when he enters, and it's this grand big thing. I mean, it's also right up Trump's alley, too. He loves it, I bet. But it was never supposed to be, well, I guess not supposed to, but it never was like that when it started. I mean, when George Washington gave his State of the Union, it was just like a letter.
That's pretty much what it was for most, over 100 years.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean go ahead.
It's sort of like it's sort of like their agenda, the agenda that they want to happen.
Yes.
Because obviously they didn't.
I think that's the next clause, actually, recommendation clause.
Yeah, and like, I have a question after this, so I'll ask. But, it was mostly just because the president obviously is sort of the president's the only person that's elected by the entire country, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. No other person in government is elected by the entire country. So he has a little bit of a say, and he can present some things that he would like to get done to Congress, but it's not this big public, charade or something like that. Mm-hmm. And now, since Wilson, it's turned into this massive thing where the president basically sets the budget and sets the agenda for Congress to have to implement, as if he is the dictator in essence. Mm-hmm. He's sort of dictating to them via us. He's using us as the leverage against them, obviously, to force them to do something that he wants, which is definitely, I believe, far outside of the kind of perceived power of the president in the founding era. I do not think that they anticipated nor wanted him to have that much legislative influence or power. And so, now we think of him that way. So now we expect him to set the budget. Now we expect him to fix the economy, which is impossible for one person to do.
Yep.
Now we expect him to make all of the laws and, everything else. And so, in essence, we have given him dictatorial powers because of that.
Yeah, well, I think when I read the recommendations clause, I see it as it's his way of saying, hey, here's what I'll vote, here's what I'll vote yes for, here's what I'm going to veto, basically. Like, obviously Congress is the legislative branch, but, this is just kind of allowing him to kind of let them know his opinion, because I mean he does have a say in it. He's got to play a part to play in that process. So it's
that's what I was going to ask about. Did we?
Go ahead.
The veto. We just haven't talked about the veto, and I can't remember if we.
I think that's in Article 1, isn't it?
Is that Article 1?
Yeah, because it's not in Article 2.
Oh, well, the veto is a pretty powerful thing.
Oh, yeah, I guess, God, we'd have to go back. Well, I know we talked about we are going to go back to Article 1 to really, because, I mean, we kind of blew over it pretty quickly and left out much good stuff, so I think we can hit that when we get back to Article 1.
Okay.
But yeah, you are. That's probably, like, his biggest, most powerful thing that he can do, basically, in terms of, like, with his legislative duties, is the veto. A lot of history behind that, but I think for the sake of this podcast, we'll save that for one of the other ones.
More detailed analysis.
Moving on. Clause 3, the convening of Congress. This is basically saying that the president can shut down Congress only for like emergency purposes, such as like wars or major super economic problems, and some kind of catastrophe has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Not too controversial. I don't really have anything to add to that. Anything on your end?
No, I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the next couple weeks.
True. Next clause, the receiving ambassadors. This one's I always laugh at this one because it basically says that the president, he receives, foreign ambassadors and people of, from foreign countries and whatnot. And it's just funny because I remember reading that part of, like, one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation were that foreign people, like foreign ambassadors, would come here and then, they'd be like, where's the guy who's supposed to meet me? Like, where am I meeting? Where am I going? What's happening? These guys would come here and be totally lost about, like, what was happening, and no one could had an answer. And so...
you need a point person, a point man.
Yeah, so it was easy. It was just easier to have a single guy there who had the responsibility, so I always thought that was funny.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that, or...
Nope. I mean, I think that was pretty straightforward.
Perfect. All right. Coming down to the last three clauses here. This is the take care clause. Now, this is one of those, well, I should expand on it a little bit. The take care clause is basically the clause that says the president has to see to it that the laws be faithfully executed. And I think it's kind of a repeat of the other things we've talked about, that he's he's vested with the executive powers, that he has, the oath of office, he's the commander-in-chief. I think it's kind of all the same stuff, just kind of reiterated.
Right.
And I think it's it's another example of him being responsible for some level of interpretation for these kinds of things. Interpretation of law, I should say.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this is probably one of the most quintessentially presidential, clauses in the whole article too, because that's his job. This is like, he's the executive, hence the care that the laws be faithfully executive goes right along with what he's supposed to do. And he's supposed to commission all the officers of the United States, which makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, that's the next clause.
Execute. Yep.
And actually, I didn't know this, but and this is a perfect segue. Next clause, the commission clause. Basically, it says, and I didn't know this, but when you go through this process of the appointments clause and everything, and you nominate someone, they get confirmed, there's a third process where the president has to commission all the officers that are confirmed by the Senate. And if he doesn't do that, then everything just is voided and it doesn't happen.
I think that's kind of what happened with Marbury versus Madison, right? Because all of these judges had been appointed and approved, but they didn't have their commissions. And then they tried to get the commissions out to them before the new president got in office, before Jefferson got in office, and they didn't get them to all of them. So they were actually not active because they didn't have the commission.
Oh my, you're so right about that. Wow, you just solved the Marbury versus Madison case.
They did.
Wow, you're so correct about that, and I never even thought of that before.
I would never put that together either, but that is really interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, it was that commission. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's so, because I looked at that and I thought it's kind of, it's placed weird. It's in the bottom section of it's the bottom of section 3, and the appointments clause is the bottom of section 2. You'd think they'd kind of be closer to each other, but it's interesting how they placed it there. I bet there's more history behind that reasoning.
Sure there is, yeah.
Which leads us to the final clause. It's actually section 4, clause 1, the only clause of this section. And it is basically the standards for impeachment, which are as follows: treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, this is very relevant, I think, for modern politics today, given the Trump impeachment debacle. But one of the questions I had for people that I was asking this for months. I would go into enemy territory on Twitter, and I would ask people, name the crimes, any crime whatsoever, even though for the Constitution, for impeachment to be legitimate, the high crimes and misdemeanors have to be equal to treason or bribery. But I expanded it, just to be fair, and I said, name any crime that he's done in the U.S. Code. Any single crime. There's tens of thousands of them, so many we can't even count them. Name one that he's violated. And no one answered, ever.
Yeah.
So, a little interesting history here.
And that's what's really interesting about impeachment, is that if you look at the actual definition, and I don't have it in front of me right now, unfortunately, but it's sort of like finding someone unfit for office. Mm-hmm. And that's what's like, what's the word? That's where it's a little gray for the whole impeachment process, is that technically it doesn't say he has to have committed a crime.
Well, doesn't it? I mean, treason is a crime. Bribery is a crime.
Treason is a crime.
Yeah, you can find I think, I agree. I think what you're trying to say is that impeachment is a political process, not a criminal process.
That's really what it is. So if they felt like, I mean, there's nothing to stop them from impeaching a president, honestly, just because they just find him unfit or something that he's done to be unfit. But yeah, I mean, that's what's really difficult about the whole impeachment process, is there's really no clarity given with all of these terms. It's like, okay, well, what's a misdemeanor, right?
Yeah.
So it's
I agree.
Bribery, bribery seems a little more straightforward. Treason seems a little more straightforward, and a little more obvious and stuff like that. But then the other section is a little more ambiguous, which makes it a little more difficult to know, okay, is Congress violating the Constitution if they impeach someone for technically not one of these things, Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting because, you could. So the House has sole power to impeach. Right. Senate has sole power to convict. I think they're both they're held to that standard though in the Constitution, because obviously the Constitution supersedes them.
Anything that they
and so but it's a double. I mean, it works both ways. I mean, even if they execute the impeachment power unconstitutionally, who's going to stop them? They have sole power. Exactly. It's not as if a president can remove people for being unconstitutional, because that'd be a pretty serious power. So I mean, that's what it's. The standard is there, and I think the framers probably expected the respective houses to kind of hold themselves to that standard. Right. But, obviously it is up to them. And I think as we've seen it play out, it's been more of a political process than anything else.
In most cases, it's been kind of like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but other than that, I think that wraps it up. Anything to add to that?
I don't think so. There's a lot of other little kind of details that we can get into at another time. But I think right now we've kind of hit on the main point. So, I think that came out really good. I think what we can do next time, like you said, executive branch agencies, there's actually in one of the books I'm reading, there's a whole section dedicated to just that. It's a note on executive agencies, and it's so much to that.
It's pretty wild. But I think let's wrap it up here, and next time we'll come back and we'll continue down into Article 3, which is that's gonna be a doozy for me.
Yeah.
All right, well, Christin, thank you so much for coming on, and we will talk to you next time.
All righty.
All right.